Last Thursday on January 20th, my grandfather passed away at the age of 90. And tomorrow morning is his memorial service. And unfortunately, I'm out on the West Coast and unable to make it back. And wanted to put together some brief reflections about my grandfather. So this is sort of a eulogy, sort of some random memories, sort of preserving some stories in the oral tradition. And just wanted to put it out there. So I always viewed myself as the luckiest grandchild. And it's not because of my stunning good looks or receding hairline or lack of a chin line, but rather my mother put herself through nursing school and became a nurse when I was a young child and I grew up a few blocks away from my grandparents. So she would often work the 3 to 11 shift. And when she did, my grandparents would watch me. So the benefit here is that I'd get to eat dinner first with my grandmother around 5 p.m. and just she and I would eat. And often after work, my grandfather would hit either the Dory or the American Legion and have some beers with friends, and then come home later, more 7, 8 o'clock-ish, and I would eat again. And so I'd have 2 dinners every night. And I have a real distinct memory of, and you'll see it in a photo later that I'll show, where my grandfather would sit at the table. And I would sit at the opposite end, and I remember there was this wooden fork and spoon that hung above the stove, and just that optic or snapshot is so clear in my mind's eye. And now I'm fortunate enough to have that fork and spoon, same one hanging in my house, to carry on that tradition. And it's funny what a powerful memory smell is. And so I have this real distinct memory, this blend of sweat, Old Spice, and Miller Lite when my grandfather would come home in the summer. And just, as clear as day, just really, really remember that. So my grandfather was a big fan of Miller Lite. So I'm going to crack a beer. My suggestion is that you hit pause on this and grab a beverage of your own if you like, and kick back, and I'm going to share some stories about my grandfather, and we're just going to go from there. I tried to do a bunch of takes on this. It's not getting any easier, and I can't put any more Visine in my eyes, so we're just going to roll with this and see where it all goes. So my grandfather was born in 1927, and he spent his formative years really in poverty that was later exacerbated by the Great Depression that came through. And so I just can't even fathom what life was like at that period in time, and what his childhood looked like. And now that I'm a father and I'm raising children of my own, I just think back to his experience and how that forged the man that he would later become. By any account, my grandfather was one tough son of a bitch that endured some powerfully traumatizing experiences at very young ages. And as is most things with life, they make a lot more sense in retrospect. And what I wanted to do today is that, by virtue of getting to hang out and have that second meal with him, a lot of times when there might have been more Miller Lights involved than there should have been, I got this really special glimpse into my grandfather and his world that I think a lot of other people never had the opportunity to have. And so I want to share some of those things because it'd be a shame to just have them all trapped in my head. So an interesting one is that my grandfather hated to ride in the car, and I mean hated. The only trips I ever remember him making growing up were from his house on Thames Street down to the police station when he was showing up for work, shooting over to the Legion to grab some beers, and the other longest one, or almost longest one, would have been heading to Southampton Golf Club to go golfing on Sunday, so roughly 20 minutes away. And the only other time he would ever get in the car for any legitimate distance was a yearly hour-and-a-half trip to Musquamacut Beach, where they would go on a 2-week vacation every summer. Otherwise, he would just not touch the car whatsoever. And I always thought that was so weird. And, hey, like, why not drive somewhere? Why not get some additional exposure and check out new places? And then I learned the story that when he was roughly 8 years old, his father, so again, we're probably roughly 1936-ish. Maybe my math's a touch off on that, but whatever it is, he drives cross country with his 5 brothers and sister and their mom. And I'm just like, holy shit. Cause I think back now, I hate traveling, but I've got GPS. I've got Google Maps. I think about how myself and my cousins Jennifer and Lauren have moved out to San Francisco, and so we've come west as well. Decades later, but we had the internet, and we were getting phone interviews set up from the other coast, and there was stability and jobs and all of that. And so this family all hops in a car and drives cross country, which had to just be mind-bending experience unto itself, but does so with no job in hand and extremely limited means. Here's the other kicker of it. The entire trip was in a Ford Model T, and there was no hotel stays. So they slept either in the car or in a tent every single night. And so so they ended up going out to Pico Riviera in the Whittier area, which I guess is roughly, east of LA by a few towns. And as a result of that, he hated traveling and refused to go on any car rides because it burned that strong of a memory into his mind for a rough experience. So anyhow, things don't work out west for the family. Go all the way back cross country again. Oh my God. And at pre-age 12, I don't remember the age he was when this occurred, but I remember he talked about his sister and one of his siblings being there, but they skipped school for the day. And again, going back to, what a tough man my grandfather is, he was so emotive when he told me this story. And so what they had done is they skipped school, and I guess there was some slaughterhouse somewhere in Springfield, and they went and they snuck onto the slaughterhouse property and found, some little area where they were able to peek through the boards at the slaughtering. And so he tells this story of just being, crying his eyes out, watching the pigs get their throats cut open, that there's blood spraying everywhere, the pigs are squealing. And I don't remember his exact words, but he just went on and on about how much it impacted him and how he never wanted to skip school again thereafter. Another one would be going back to childhood. As I look back now and as I tell some of these stories, I'm not sure my grandfather had anything of what we would remotely understand as an actual childhood. If for those that are familiar with Springfield, Massachusetts, where he grew up and has lived his entire life, there's a lot of talk about how much more violent Springfield has gotten with times. But by his accounts, it sounded like it was pretty damn tough in the 30s as well. And he would talk about how, there was the Irish section and the Italian section, go through all of your ethnicities. And he said the deal was you didn't leave your neighborhood. So you would stay kind of in your section the entire time. He goes, but we, fighting was the thing. And so he said that the way you work this is you put a stick on your shoulder and you walk into somebody else's neighborhood. And you just walk boldly down the street until they don't like that you're in their neighborhood anymore. And then you bump into each other, and whoever knocks the stick off the other one's shoulder, that was the sort of dinging of the bell to start the fight. And I just thought that was, again, a crazy teenage experience. Another one that he had for me was talking about football and, raising kids now and everything organic and so safe and all the, the modern progresses we made. These guys are playing full contact football with no helmets and no padding and, just shoes. And so he talked about being a smaller kid growing up and being in junior high, and it's all high school kids that are playing football. And he wants to play. And so decides to take a position as a lineman. And he talks about this kid that was significantly larger than him that was in high school. And so they set up and cross each other, get in the 3-point stance. Quarterback snaps, high school kid, pow! Smashes my grandfather in the face with a punch, knocks him down, literally runs over him on his chest and tackles the quarterback. So he tells me, he says, I gather myself up, bloody nose, I'm a mess, but I don't want to step out of the game. So he plays a couple more rotations, and they're now on offense. Sets up 3-point stance again across from the same guy that punched him in the face a few plays back. That was way bigger than him. So quarterback calls snap, My grandfather throws a handful of sand in the guy's face. He goes, I smash him into the nose, knock him down, run over him. Quarterback throws the ball to him, makes a touchdown. And he said that was one of the last times he ever played football. Playing off the theme of fistfights and all the brawling that was going on at that time, I remember him sharing words of wisdom on how to fight growing up. And he says, Jake, let me tell you, it's not like you see in the movies. It's not, one person takes a swing and then the other person takes a swing and you're ducking and you're going back and forth. He goes, no, none of that bullshit. He goes, you get into a fight, bam, 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 bam. He goes, you just keep hitting him again and again and again until you knock him down. And that's how you win a fist fight. Okay. Duly noted, Gramps. Glad to know. Just crazy stuff. And so as he went into his teenage years, we're now talking the start of World War II. And interestingly, my grandfather enrolls in the Navy as soon as he was eligible to make a better life for himself. And at this point, World War II is already in motion. And it really says something about how tough your childhood is and about how rough your home circumstances are, where joining the military and going into active combat, like there's a legit war going on. Like this isn't like getting extra credits on the weekend for ROTC or kind of dabbling in officer training school or whatever that might be. This is like you're guaranteed you're probably going to see something pretty crazy. And he was still choosing that over what he had, both to grow himself, but also to get out of where he was at. So, again, going back to what a tough dude he was, he gets a tattoo while he's in the Navy. And it was a tattoo of a dagger going through a heart that read death before dishonor. And, we're starting to get a lot more insight into World War II, Vietnam, the Korean Wars, as a lot of these documentaries and things are coming together. But one of the things that I think we fail to appreciate sometimes is that generation went through a version of hell that hopefully most of us will never know. And like most of his brothers in arms that he went into service with, I don't have a single memory of him ever talking about his military experience. The only times it would ever come up was when he would be disciplining or, sounding off on things being out of order in the house. And listen, when we were in the Navy, this had to be there, that had to be there. I remember getting yelled at for taking too long a shower as a kid. And he would say, listen, when we were in the Navy, you got one washcloth, one bar of soap, and you had 5 minutes to shower. And so that type of thing, we hear from time to time, but never anything about actual combat experiences, except for a few. And there was a handful of nights where there's probably a few too many Miller Lights involved, and he freed up and shared a few stories with me. One that comes to mind for me is when I was young, I was a pretty poor swimmer. I hated the water, and he was having none of it. And he starts telling me these stories about how in their training they would jump off the side of a destroyer and have to, have their heel of their palm under their chin so that the water wouldn't be blasting through their nose, and that you were trying to minimize surface tension. And I just think about how crazy that would be, but that doesn't even remotely scratch the surface. One of the most powerful memories I have of what life was like in his eyes is he tells me about a day where whatever the vessel is that he's on, I wish I knew, but they get caught in a tremendous storm in the South Pacific, and it sounds like it's one of these perfect storm type of deals. And he talks about it being black as night, and lightning is smashing and lighting up the sky. And there's huge swells and waves coming over their ship, and it's knocking it back and forth in every which way. And things just get progressively worse to where most people assume that this is where they're going to die. And cargo starts coming loose on the deck. Chains are snapping. Things are starting to break. People are going overboard. He explained to me that once these chains had snapped, watching another man get crushed by the pallets that they were holding against the edge of the deck as things would start to slide back and forth, and people almost choking to death on their own vomit from the seasickness and not being able to get up and basically just survive at this point. And he tells me the story of, and my grandfather's probably, either 18 or 19 at this point in time, max, of how this young guy comes up to him and says, "I'm only 16, please save me." And my grandfather said that he grabbed them and found some additional chain that was loose, and he chained the two of them around to a post and held it tight because he couldn't get a knot out of it. So he just used his own strength for the remainder of the storm to hold the two of them chained to this post, probably saved this guy's life. And when they finally, get to wherever they're going and touch land, he talked to me about how he immediately brought that boy over to the commanding officer and said, "Hey, this kid's too young. It's time for him to go back home and be a kid." And I think about him being a very old 18-year-old and the foresight to be looking out for somebody that way in a very paternal role at that point in time, when probably, every body that was available was an asset, and to look out for him on that level. But it also shows the mettle of men that were available at that time, of the courage of a 16-year-old just being able to enroll. And so my final one on this topic is I have these vague memories of him telling me about his, we'll call them interactions with Japanese soldiers. And it never made any sense to me because I didn't think he ever saw actual combat. And just that. So I never shared the stories with anyone because I always assumed that maybe he was confused or mixing up facts or whatever it might be. So in reading my grandfather's obituary the other day, I learned that him and his fellow Seabees were captured by the Japanese and held prisoner. And he was later awarded the World War II Victory Medal, the American Area Medal, and the Asiatic Pacific Medal for his service. And again, going back to, what this generation was all about, not only never talking about combat and what he saw, but also to have been that storied and had that much of a crazy, just badass, mind-bending experience, and to never share that with anybody. And he wasn't singular in this. That was what these guys did. And I think back to, the stupid shit that I've been through and how, just holding on to things that we're not processing can jam us up. I can't imagine coming home after those experiences during those years and leading anything remotely close to a normal existence. And so I start to have a much more sophisticated or layered or nuanced understanding of what his life looked like through his eyes, especially for the remainder of his years. So time goes on. My grandfather returns from the war, and he starts a family with his wife, Marion. They honeymoon at Niagara Falls. So that might have been the other longest trip he would ever been on. And he continues his dedication as a public servant and joins the Springfield Police Force. And here's where the story gets particularly interesting for me, is that for someone that grew up and it sounds like pretty intense squalor and poverty and had no real education, he was actually quite ambitious and committed to personal growth and his own development. And I never really viewed him that way. I just kind of viewed it as he was a cop that worked really hard. But now that I look back, I see how much he actually invested in himself and tried to make himself be a lifetime learner. He was one of the only cops I know in that era that was subscribing to the Wall Street Journal at the time. And he was always taking or studying for the next exam to continue to move up in the ranks. And I just remember there always being highlighters around the house and him going up into his bedroom to study so that, me and my cousins or whatever kids were around weren't bothering him. I remember Lee Iacocca's autobiography on the counter and reading that. And so it's particularly interesting. And testament to this is not only was he the first in his family, I have to assume, to go to college, but he then took it one step further and got a master's in criminal justice. So, he gets a graduate degree as well. And, I remember one of the nights of him coming home and we're having a second dinner, as it were, and him talking about just how proud he was. He didn't say it in those words, of course, but you could read between the lines, and how proud he was that he was able to elevate himself to that level, and how much it meant to him to put himself in that class. And yeah, I remember a time where he had used the word apex in a sentence, is what he said in class. And the professor said, does anyone else do you Mr. Rook, know what apex means? Yes, I do, sir. Does anyone else in the class know what apex means? No one answers. And so I remember him telling me how proud and excited he was that he knew a word that nobody else did. And I know that, apex isn't exactly a super cutting edge Shakespeare or something like that, but it was a big deal to him around the personal growth. And it meant a lot to him to both invest in education and grow that way. And so over time, he would rise through the ranks, and eventually, became lieutenant and sergeant and captain. And he was a hell of a cop. And let's just say he was not the one that you wanted to mess around with. And it's funny because you guys remember those hand tensioner, grip strengthener type tools back in the day that would be, made out of metal with some plastic overlays. He was always cranking on those things, and had just a crazy grip. And it's funny because my wife constantly refers to me as monkey hands and says I have super human strength as far as grip goes. And he tells me the story one day about he's responding to a call, and a guy takes a swing at him and hits him in the face. And as the guy's trying to run away, my grandfather grabs onto his leather jacket and grabbed the guy so tightly that he broke his own thumb, pulling him around, and pulled him down and arrested him. But one of my favorite stories, and then I guess one other story on that front, would be this time where I was asking him if he ever fired a gun, and he said no. He goes, it was very rare, but he told me about this one time where he was on Moreland Street and he was walking the beat. And you got to remember, at this point in time, that was a thing. Cops would just regularly walk the beat around neighborhoods. He didn't have a cruiser at the time, and there was a bank robbery, and he got word that the car was coming down that street. So he stands in the middle of the road with his hands up. They charge him down through the road, and he explained how he discharged all of his ammunition and shot through the vehicle's windshield multiple times, and they crashed into another car and were later arrested. But my favorite story of his time in law enforcement is years later, I would get a job as a correctional officer. So I'm just trying to get one of the slides up here. Give me a second. Yeah, sorry. So I'm working as a correctional officer as a summer job during college. I'm maybe 20, 21 or something like that. And this ranking officer that was probably in his 50s maybe comes up and he says, I see your last name's Rook. He goes, any relation to Captain Walter Rook? I go, yeah, he's my grandfather. He goes, whoa, your grandfather's one tough son of a bitch. He goes, let me tell you a little story. He goes, I remember this one day, I was a rookie, and he says, I was hanging out. I was stationed in the holding cell where they would bring, degenerates that had just been arrested, but not fully booked yet. We've all had that image in our mind of that big holding cell, kind of where everyone's free and loose and whatnot. So he goes, this particular day, he goes, I don't know if it was a full moon or what. He goes, but we had 20 to 30 just knuckleheads in there, and they're going crazy, and they're screaming, and there's fighting going on. And he goes, we're understaffed that day, and it's just me and one other guy, and we don't know what to do. We're yelling at him. We can't calm him down. He goes, all of a sudden, you hear this tremendous slam of a door down the hallway. And he goes, your grandfather comes tear ass down the hallway. And he says to me, open up the holding cell. And he goes, sir, I can't. We're the only two on duty. He cuts him out. He said, I said, open the fucking cell. He goes, your grandfather charges into the holding cell where there's all these people going nuts, puts himself at massive risk, and screams, listen, I'm trying to get some fucking work done. And if you don't shut the fuck up, the next fucking person that talks, I'm going to come in here and smash their fucking teeth out. Stares him down for a few seconds. You could hear a pin drop. Does a square sharp turn, walks out, locks the cell, goes back down the hallway, slams the door shut. He goes, nobody said another word the rest of the day. He explained to me how it was just burned in his mind to no end. Another favorite one of mine was I was being babysat at my grandparents one day, and my grandfather sent the mounted patrol over to the house for their beat that day. And so this was sort of like the poor man's version of getting a pony. And so I got to pet the horse and go for a small ride on it, I think maybe. I remember being super scared trying to feed it carrots, but was just always trying to figure out little ways in his special style to be that present source of love and grandparent and make things extra special. Uh, Another really fond memory that I have in my mind's eye is when we grew up on Nye Street. It was one particular Christmas where my mother was hosting maybe Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and I had gotten some dart guns for Christmas. And I remember my grandfather sitting down with me and setting up the targets and showing me how to aim a gun and taking turns with me shooting these targets down with the darts. And it's a really fond memory for me. Another one is I remember he had this little poodle when I was growing up, my grandmother and him, named Toby. And my grandmother always used to say that Toby was Walter's only friend. She said, you never had any other friends but that dog, and that was the one that he always came back to. Interesting, my grandfather was sort of a foodie in his own right. One of my memories is walking into my grandparents' house and him just always cooking. There was always the smell of food in the air. I remember in the winters, that both aroma and sensory deal, where there's some steam coming in from whatever you're cooking, and it kind of fills the house in a certain way, and the windows are starting to steam up. And so he was always cooking soups. Soups were his deal. So he loved to cook pasta fagioli, and he would do turkey noodle soup and split pea soup, which were some of his favorites. And I remember him talking to me about his Italian friend who gave him some pasta soup one day that was Italian, but it was very bland. And he said, well, I didn't want to spice it up too much for you because I know you're Irish and have a really sensitive palate. And my grandfather was very proud and saying, no, I want it the way it's supposed to be. Please make it in your style. And he had a lot of pride in making food for the family and turning leftovers into something interesting. I remember he kept his knife razor sharp and no one was allowed to use it. In his room, he had this print of an Indian slumped over a horse holding a spear. And he said this to me a lot. So I'd love to know how it came into his life, but at least on multiple occasions, he would call me up into his bedroom and he would point at the Native American on the horse, and he would say, look at him. He goes, you think you're having a tough day? Whenever you think you're down in life, I want you to look at him. He lost absolutely everything and all of his land and everything that meant anything to him and his pride, and he still had to figure out how to carry on and go forth in life. Don't know what to make of it hugely so, how much that connected to his life experience or trying to hold on. But that was just always around and a big memory for me. But most of my memories with him revolve around golf. Interestingly, growing up in poverty and his whole experience, you would not assume golf to be the likely sport and hobby that he would endeavor to spend the majority of his time on. And as a young man that idolized him, I wanted nothing more to do than to golf with him. And every once in a while I got to, and I'd get to drive the cart. And it'd be absolutely amazing. My hope is that now that he's passed, I think of my buddy Jason Chorget that I lost years ago, who also loved Miller Lite and golf, and all of my grandfather's golfing buddies, Shanahan and Buddy Tarangelo and Jimmy Patrick and Charlie Murphy. And I like the thought that they're all up in heaven golfing right now, having some Miller Lights and enjoying themselves. But it was fascinating to go golfing with him. And I think back to two stories come to mind on this one. One particular day, I get to go play with him. It's going to be a Saturday morning. I'm like, this is freaking awesome. I'm going to play with Papa. And I'm all excited to go. My grandmother packs us a lunch for the day. And, we hop in the car. It's 6:45 in the morning, 7:15, something like that. I'm in the passenger seat. I think I had just gotten my learner's permit. And, we drive away from my grandmother's house, turn the corner, get about a block and a half down. He pulls the car over. I'm like, I wonder what this is about. He goes, hop over. You're going to drive. Like, this is the greatest day ever, right? I get to drive and go golfing with my grandfather. And I'm like, I wonder why he's letting me drive. So it goes around the back of the car, sits down, hops in the passenger seat. Next thing you hear, starts popping back Miller Lights. I'm like, touche, I got you now. Another favorite story of mine is not so many years after that, he got me a job as a cart boy at Chicopee Country Club, which would be one of the more formative experiences of my life and a wealth of just wonderful memories for me. And so one day I'm not that good at that point in time, and I'm super self-conscious about it. And I get paired with this older couple that are probably in their 70s. And we get a couple holes in, and we're about to tee off, and the guy says, what's your name? I go, Jason. He goes, well, what's your last name? I go, Rook. He goes, any relation to Walter Rook? I'm like, yeah, he's my grandfather. He goes, that fucking son of a bitch. And I'm just like, oh boy. I'm like, So, we go back and forth on this for a few, and I'm like, so what's the deal? And he says, let me tell you a story about your grandfather. He goes, we're friends. And he goes, we were really close friends. And he goes, I'm on my first date with a woman that I told him I really liked, who now is my wife here with me. And he goes, we're at this Italian restaurant. I think we had either just gotten appetizers or the main course or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden the door swings open and it's your grandfather in full police uniform. And he demands, let's pretend the guy's name's Joey Bag of Donuts. He's like, where's Joey Bag of Donuts? And he goes, I try to turn away. He storms over to my table, says that I'm wanted for robbery, handcuffs me in front of everybody, and drags me out the back of the restaurant in utter shame and to my date's shock and horror. He goes, as soon as we get out in the back, he goes, he starts laughing so goddamn hard, I'm worried he's going to wet himself. And he goes, I'm furious beyond all belief. And so it's funny that for all of my grandfather's surface toughness, there was always like a little bit of jokester going on. And so he liked to be the prankster. And my final golf story. So it became my obsession. I'm sure there was some connection around, me getting good at golf as sort of a way to get approval and connection with my grandfather. And so it haunted me for a long time. And finally, after just, playing nonstop and lessons and practicing, I finally break 80, which if you're not a golfer is kind of a big milestone of progress. And I remember like the only thing I wanted to do was to get home as quickly as possible so I could call him. And then finally I call and I tell my grandmother, and she goes, oh my gosh, honey, so happy for you and proud of you. She goes, he's going to be so excited. Let me get him. So grabs my grandfather. I'm like, Papa, I did it. I finally broke 80. I shot 78 today. And he responds deadpan, yeah, well, don't expect to do it every single time. Okay, I won't, Grandpa. Thank you. And that's kind of how he was. Whenever he would go to Musquamacut, he would love to surf cast, but there was this amusingly elusive aspect to it, which is I remember, maybe watching him do this for 20 years. I don't ever remember him catching a fish. And so not only was he not a particularly lucky fisherman, he also wasn't much of a fashion mogul. So my grandfather would be surf casting with a hat on, tank top, a long button shirt on over its shorts, and then he would wear his black dress socks from the police work and go into the water. And I just always laugh when I think of that image. He was immensely generous, and I'll get into more of his generosity later, but there was this amusing dichotomy because he would either be immensely generous or cheap as hell at different times. His name was Walter, and we would jokingly call him Wallygator, kidding that his hands couldn't reach his wallet to pull out for the tip. But I remember one day going back home to visit him, and he was at the Legion, and I thought I'd go meet him with his buddies. And I decided, hey, I'm going to buy everybody a round of drinks that he's hanging out with. There's maybe 5 of us. The bill comes to like $7. And I said, oh, no, I want to, buy all 6, including myself, beers. And she goes, yeah, that's $7. I'm like, man, this is amazing. I got a drink at the Legion. So I want to say I pushed a 10 over and I said something like, hey, I think we're all good. He goes, don't be coming in here throwing your goddamn money around. He goes, we don't tip like that around here. And I think back to another story where, one of my uncles had hooked him up with a location for an oil change. And he said, "Oh yeah, Dad, just go over to Bobby's garage or whatever it is. He'll take care of you." So Bobby later calls up my uncle and says, "Hey," he goes, "let me tell you what your dad did today." He says, rather than coming in for the full oil change and whatnot, he stopped at an auto repair store and bought the oil and filters first, and then just came over and asked if I would give him a discount if I just transferred it all, but he brought his own product. He was, you kind of get this from talking about how he was committed to education and whatnot, that he was an unlikely Renaissance man. There was two types of TV in the house that I remember. One was golf on Sunday, and then the other one is he had this really peculiar habit of watching the TV with mute on. And wow, I'm blanking on what it was. It was probably Bloomberg or the equivalent thereof. But he would always be watching the ticker, and I just remember him constantly. There'd be little notes scribbled down all around the house with stock calls on them and pluses and minuses, and I find it just fascinating that a man of his background and with his educational level actually both follow the market but manage his own portfolio, which I think is just fascinating. And the final thing I remember TV-wise is that it was a big thing for the house to get together on Sunday evenings at 7 p.m. and we'd all watch 60 Minutes. And this is, back when investigative journalism was actually a thing. And so that was sort of like a feed the head type of moment. Some other, memories, in addition to always growing his mind, I remember there always being dumbbells in the house and, him doing arm exercises or whatever it might be. And I remember him being in his 70s and still doing knee bends and putting his arms out and going back and forth and telling me about, how important it is to stay active. On the food front too, I think back to him being an early adopter, and he loved Grey Poupon. And so the sandwich that was always the go-to for him. He probably had this 6 days a week. How he did not get sick of it, I have no clue. But it'd be Wonder Bread, American cheese, Grey Poupon, and Crockett's Polish ham, and that was his jam. And I understand him much more in retrospect, which is I don't know if it's a fun spot to be in, because I almost get to re-experience him and rewrite the memory tape in a certain way, which is a fascinating process. An example of this is that whenever I would come over, or especially if me and my cousins were over, we'd be raising absolute hell, just going nuts and running around like mad and yelling and banging and throwing things and just generally causing total chaos and commotion in the house. And he would consistently remove himself from the house whenever we were around, and all of a sudden find some household project or yard work or whatever it might be that he would pursue. And I just always thought that was so odd and perverse. And I'm like, hey, we're not here that often. Why does he always do this? And I think back to, so now that I'm a dad, one of the things that I notice is that when my kids cry, it physically unravels me. And so when there's that crying and screaming going on, I don't do super well internally. And I kind of get now, going back, why he would remove himself and want to have that more of a state of peace, and how, for whatever reason, the loud noise and the screaming and the banging would just trigger things. I also probably got to see him cry more than most other folks did. And I remember one night where he was out on the front porch and, pretty actively crying. And my grandmother came in and I said, hey, what's wrong? And I don't know or remember the details, but something just happened with his brothers, whether they had gotten into an argument or something was wrong, but it hit him pretty hard. And she said, you know what, honey, she was just, maybe I was 10 or so. She was, just go out. Papa needs a hug. And I remember going out there and hugging my grandfather. Again, this guy who was tough as nails, what I'm watching cry and not really knowing what to do, and him telling me that he loved me. And, now as I've kind of processed grief on my own this week and shed my own tears, the comfort I get hugging my own children and connecting to them and the grounding that comes from them. So it's interesting to see him in retrospect and understand it better. Uh, and in many ways, one of his legacies was actually as an unlikely great father, if that makes sense. For a lot of obvious reasons, based on what his childhood informative experiences were like, I don't think fatherhood came very naturally to him at all. And so he learned how to contribute the best way he could on his own terms. So it wasn't really in the coddling or the showering with warm words of love, uh, where I think even he would admit, he wished he could have done better. But it was in the doing. He wouldn't talk about courage or doing the right thing or working hard or studying, etc., that so many people do without the corresponding actions to back it up. Rather, he would model these behaviors through his own behavior, and in doing so would set an example of how to lead a life that didn't need to be interpreted, but merely observed to meet its mark as a lesson on how to become, how to evolve, what to look like, how to conduct yourself, how to develop a work ethic, and grow and be responsible and things of that nature. Also, as a young child, I remember he would always call me Jake. Hey, Jake the Rake, Jake Jerkabowski. And I just assumed it was he didn't know what my actual name was. Years in life later, I learned that Jake is actually the diminutive of Jason. So who knew? Apparently he did. But he says one day, Jake, go out and get me a beer. And at this age, whatever age I'm at, I'm beginning to get in my own mischief. So I used to think it was the funniest thing in the world to go get him a beer, but shake the shit out of it before I handed it to him and it would explode. And let's just say he wasn't a real big fan of that. So he asked me to go and get him another one. And I come back with a glint in my eye, and this is the middle of the winter. And I'm all like, Papa, there's no more Miller Lite. You're out. And he responds back with his own shit-eating grin. He goes, me boy, this isn't my first time. Just go out in the backyard, put your boots on, walk over to the eave trough, take 3 steps to your left and dig. I go outside, and he had, like a squirrel, preemptively planning for that Thanksgiving. He had buried a case of Miller Lite in the backyard in the snow, so he'd be ready when the munitions ran out. So he passed last week at age 90, but in his, let's call it late 70s, maybe early 80s, I noticed a really interesting change in him take place, where I think his true essence actually started to come through more and more. And I started to see a part of him that he probably put on the shelf, years ago, and probably before his 10th birthday even, in order to protect himself through his own life. Like I said earlier, he was actually a jokester at heart, and you started to see a little bit more of this coming through. He became much softer. I found him laughing much more freely, saying God bless and I love you much more often. In certain ways, he almost became chummy, and it was really interesting to see that side of him and what that experience was like. Reflecting on legacy, my grandfather spent the last months of his life at the Holyoke Soldiers Home, which as a VA hospital isn't exactly Club Med. And at first it gave me pause that he was there and, hey, is this the best thing or not? But then I started to reflect, going back to understanding him better now on some of the absolute atrocities and travesties and tragedies that these guys went through that were in the service during those years. And my takeaway on this was that I couldn't think of a more fitting send-off to spend his final days with the band of brothers who had traveled to hell and back together, and that now it was time for them to travel to heaven for their next leg. And for the first time ever, I can really appreciate the Viking concept of Valhalla and eating and drinking at the Great Hall with your fellow warriors. And so in many ways, I think it was the perfect end note for what he had experienced. Another aspect of legacy that I think really carries on for me is that I was raised by a single mom. And so in many ways, he was a lot of my forming father figure type of influence and energy. And my time spent with my grandfather really informed for me a lot of what I understood it to mean to be a man. And those experiences have formed more of my life views and sort of my DNA, I guess, than I could ever capture in this tribute. But if I could boil it down to one word, it would be duty. And what that means for me is when there's a right thing to do, and then there's everything else. And that was very much how he lived his life. There wasn't a lot of gray in his world. And so again, there was the right thing to do, and there was everything else. And no matter how difficult the charge for him, how scared you were, how unlikely you are to win your battle or to rise above your own demons, you deliver on your duty. No stories, no excuses. If it's the right thing to do, you handle your shit and you get it done. And so that sense of duty is probably what I think, if I could sum it up for anything, that he really passed down for me. And I guess, the final thing, I'd say on that would be that, our duties and obligations will change depending on what the charge is at the time, whether that's duties to your spouse, your children, your tribe, your country, your best friend, whatever your cause, your mission. But as I experienced my grandfather, the thread of duty that I watched woven through his life was a duty to help others and to take a stand for those who weren't strong enough to take a stand for themselves. And so I'd like to end on that with a story on that note that reinforces it. So it's a cold winter night. It is one of my clearer memories. And my grandparents had a windowed in porch on the front of their house. They had a couch and a couple of chairs on it. And they spent as much time out there as possible. And so I remember one night I ate dinner with my grandmother, and all excited to have second dinner with my grandfather. So just sitting there waiting around, how at that young age, you basically wait like a dog looking out the window. Is that him? Is that him? Is that him? And so finally he comes home. I hear the car in the driveway, the headlights shine through, and I'm all excited. But he doesn't come through and doesn't enter the house for a while. And I wonder what's going on. And so finally I walk out onto the porch, and he's sitting there by himself, readying himself essentially to come inside. And he's clearly emotive and just not himself. And so I sit down next to him, and he explains to me how there is a family that lives on the corner, and it was a single mom with 3 kids, and they weren't doing well. And by not doing well, it wasn't that they didn't have the newest Xbox or whatever it might be, that they were struggling to survive, literally. And so my grandfather had been spending time, whenever we would go up to the Legion, passing the hat around, collecting money for them. And that month, before he came in that night, he was coming back from her house, where he walked down and gave her enough money to have heat turned on for the rest of the winter. And as he started to cry a bit about it, and you could tell how just much it meant to him, he turned to me and he said, "Isn't that what life's all about? To help people?" And so if there's a final lesson that I can draw from this experience and his legacy, it's this. It's that we don't have to be tough nearly as much as we think we do, and that we have the opportunity to love and to serve a lot more than we believe we have the capacity for. And so as my family reshuffles the deck of our own structure, and a man, a husband, a brother, a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather passes, the song that I'm going to play by the Ducks very powerfully comes to mind for me. And it's titled, "Who Will Take My Place?" And as we answer the question of who will take his place, my hope is that it's all of us, and that we lean in and serve from a place of love, contribution, and service. And that the world's tough enough. And if my grandfather could endure what he went through and still step up and serve from a foundation of love, we certainly can too. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy what follows. I love you, Papa.
If they shoot me down, to shut me down, ooh. my place. If they bring an army into this town, ooh, take my place. If they rule the land and silence me, when I'm laid out with injury, when my words won't matter anymore, ooh, take my place. Revolution, you are not my own. Ooh, take my place. There are flowers painted on these stones. Ooh, take my place. When the silence of oppression dies, overheard beyond the battle cry, are the words of final compromise. Ooh, will take my place. When the dogs of war are on the land, ooh, take my place. When you forfeit life to take a stand, ooh, take my place. When the dreamers fear the simplest thought, when the bloodshed takes all that you've got, when this world's an empty creaking floor, ooh, will take my place.